A homeless young man returned. A Hells Angels wallet. 350 brothers repaid his honesty. In an unbelievable way. Danny woke up shaking. The cold had found its way through the torn seam of his sleeping bag again, the same spot he'd tried to fix with duct tape 3 times now. It never held. The tent was small and gray, patched with a blue tarp on one side, where the rain always got in. He'd found it behind a hardware store back in September, half broken, and it had been his home ever since. He lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere close by, a truck rumbled down the highway. Farther off, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The sky outside the thin tent fabric was still dark, that deep blue-black that comes right before dawn, when the whole world feels like it's holding its breath. Danny sat up slowly. His breath came out in little clouds, even though he was still inside the tent. December, in this part of the state, didn't play around. He rubbed his hands together, trying to get some feeling back into his fingers, and reached for the small backpack he used as a pillow. Inside, he had almost nothing. A spare shirt, a toothbrush with the bristles going flat, and his money, folded into a tight little square and tucked in the bottom, like hiding it made it worth more. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He unfolded the bills carefully, like they might tear if he wasn't gentle with them. $3, 2 quarters, and a dime. He counted it twice, even though he already knew the number by heart. Less than $5. That had to last him. He didn't know how long. He allowed himself a small, tired laugh. Not because anything was funny, just because sometimes laughing was better than the other thing his body wanted to do. From the bottom of the backpack, he pulled out a granola bar. It was the last one from a box he'd bought 2 weeks ago at the gas station down the road. He unwrapped it slowly, careful not to lose a single crumb, and broke it in half. 1 half now. 1 half for later. That was the rule he'd made for himself. And Danny didn't break his own rules. Rules were the only thing that had ever really belonged to him. He chewed slowly, making it last, and watched the gray light start to creep in through the gap in the tent flap. Marge's diner sat about 30 yards away, its back parking lot lit by a single buzzing lamp that flickered every few seconds, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to work. Danny knew every inch of that lot. He knew what time Rita usually came in to start the ovens. He knew which mornings there were extra biscuits, and which mornings the delivery truck came and left boxes stacked by the dumpster that sometimes had bruised fruit or bread going stale, but still good enough to eat. He unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, keeping his body low, watching the kitchen's back door the way a person watches a clock, waiting for something. Nothing yet. Too early, even for Rita. Danny let the flap fall closed again and finished the last bite of his half a granola bar, wishing his stomach would believe that it counted as breakfast, even though he was still hungry. He wrapped the other half back up gently and returned it to the backpack. Later, he told himself. Later. Outside, the sky kept lightening, turning from black to a deep purple, and then slowly into a pale gray that meant the sun was close now, right at the edge of the hills. Danny always liked this part of the morning, when everything felt quiet and still, like the world hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. He wrapped his arms around his knees and waited, listening to the sound of his own breathing, steady and slow, and the distant hum of the highway, and somewhere far off, the first low rumble of an engine that wasn't a truck. Danny's ears caught it right away. He knew the sound, deep and rolling. Not one engine, but many, moving together like a wave. The bikes kept coming for almost 20 minutes, engine after engine rolling into the lot, until the whole place shook with the sound of them. Danny stayed low in his tent, peeking through the gap in the flap, watching a dozen Harleys line up in neat rows like they'd done it 1,000 times before. The men who climbed off them were big. Leather jackets, patches on their backs, beards, boots that hit the pavement hard. Danny had heard about the Hells Angels from Rita once, when she was closing up and didn't know he was still by the dumpster. She'd said they came every Tuesday, like clockwork, and that nobody in town messed with them, and they didn't mess with anybody either. Just breakfast, she said. Just eggs and coffee and loud laughing. Danny believed her mostly, but he still kept his distance. A person alone in a tent behind a diner learned fast that the safest thing to do around big groups of strangers was to stay small and stay quiet. He watched them walk into Marge's one by one, the bell over the door jingling each time, until the lot went still again. The buzzing lamp flickered. The morning sun had fully broken over the hills now, turning the frost on the parking lot into little sparkling patches that would melt away in another hour. Danny waited a while longer, just to be sure. Then he unzipped the tent the rest of the way and crawled out, stiff and cold, his knees cracking as he stood. This was the part of his day that felt the most like a job. He walked the edges of the lot with his eyes down, scanning the ground the way some people scanned for lost keys. Cigarette butts he could sometimes trade to a guy 2 blocks over who paid a few cents for the tobacco left inside them. Loose change that fell out of pockets. Once he'd found a whole $5 bill stuck under a windshield wiper, blown there from somewhere else, and he'd eaten good for 2 days on that. He moved slow, careful, keeping half an eye on the diner's windows in case anyone glanced out. The bikes sat in their rows, chrome catching the morning light, engines still ticking as they cooled. Danny had always thought they looked like something alive, resting. That was when he saw it. Near the back tire of one of the bikes, close to the kickstand, something dark and rectangle-shaped sat half-hidden in the gravel. At first, Danny thought it might be a phone case or a folded-up napkin. He almost walked past it, but something made him stop and look closer. A wallet. Thick brown leather, worn soft at the corners like it had been carried for years. It must have slipped out of a pocket when the owner swung his leg over the bike. Danny stood there a second, looking around. The lot was empty. The diner windows were steamed up from the inside, full of noise and warmth he couldn't hear from here. Nobody was watching. He crouched down and picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. His fingers found the fold and opened it before he even really decided to. Cash. A lot of it. More than he had ever held in his life. Thick stacks of 20s and 50s folded together, the paper crisp and green. His hands actually trembled a little just looking at it. He didn't count it right there, but his brain did the rough math without even trying. Thousands. It had to be close to $3,000. Tucked behind the cash, a driver's license. The photo showed a big man with a heavy beard and hard eyes that somehow still looked kind. The name underneath read, Bernard Bear Coletti. Behind that, folded soft with age, a photograph. A woman smiling at whoever was taking the picture, her hair blowing a little to one side like there'd been wind that day. Danny stood frozen at the edge of the lot, the wallet open in his 2 hands, his stomach growling loud enough that he almost laughed again. That same tired laugh from earlier. He looked toward the diner, steam still fogging the windows, laughter and voices rumbling faintly from inside. Then he looked back down at the wallet, at all that money, sitting right there in his freezing hands. Danny walked a block before he let himself sit down. His legs just gave out on him, right there on a curb behind a closed-up hardware store, and he dropped onto the cold concrete like his body had made the decision before his mind caught up. He turned the wallet over in his hands. Once, twice. The leather was soft and worn, like it had been sat on and carried and loved in that strange way men love their things without ever saying so. $3,000. Maybe more. He hadn't counted it exact, but he knew what that kind of money meant. It meant a motel room with a lock on the door and a heat that actually worked. It meant real food, not scraps from a dumpster or a plate. Rita slid him when she thought nobody was looking. It meant boots without holes in them. It meant not being cold, not for a long time. Nobody would know. That was the thing that kept circling in his head like a fly he couldn't swat away. Nobody saw him pick it up. The man who dropped it, this Bear Coletti with the hard eyes in the photo, he'd probably just think he lost it somewhere on the road, or some other trucker took it, or it fell out during a gas stop 40 miles back. Nobody would ever come looking for a homeless kid behind Marge's diner. Danny closed his eyes. His mother's voice came to him then, the way it sometimes did, soft and worn thin by memory but still clear enough to hear. She used to say it to him when he was small, back before the hospital, back before everything got hard. She'd say it while she brushed his hair down flat in the mornings, or while she tucked him in at night in whatever apartment they were living in that year. Danny, baby, they can take everything from you, your house, your money, even the people you love, but they can't ever take who you are, not unless you let them. He hadn't understood it back then. He was just a little kid, and it sounded like something grown-ups said to make themselves feel better. But sitting on that curb with $3,000 in his lap and his stomach aching with hunger, he understood it all the way down to his bones. If he kept this money, he'd have a warm bed. But he'd lose the one thing he had left that was actually his. His mother was gone. His foster families were gone. The system had spit him out at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and a bus ticket to nowhere. But his character, that was still his. Nobody had been able to touch it yet. Not the group homes, not the hunger, not the 8 months of sleeping outside in a tent that smelled like mildew. He wasn't about to hand it over now for a stack of cash that wasn't his. Danny stood up. His knees ached from the cold concrete, and his stomach twisted with hunger and something else, something like fear. He'd heard the stories about the Hells Angels, same as everyone else in town. Rita said they were decent, but decent men still had a clubhouse most people were smart enough to avoid. He'd walked past that building before, keeping to the far side of the street, same as everybody did. But that's where he needed to go. He tucked the wallet inside his jacket, close to his chest, like it might try to escape if he wasn't careful, and started walking. 2 miles. That was the distance, more or less, from the diner to the clubhouse on the edge of town. He'd walked farther than that plenty of times, scavenging for cans or looking for work that never came through. But this walk felt different. Every step made his stomach tighter. Every step made him want to turn around. He didn't turn around. The road stretched out flat and gray under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to snow. Danny kept his head down, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the wallet pressed against his ribs like a stone. Cars passed him now and then, slowing just enough for the driver to get a good look at the skinny kid walking alone on the shoulder, then speeding back up like they hadn't seen anything at all. He was used to that. Being looked past. Being invisible. By the time the clubhouse came into view, a low brick building with motorcycles parked in a long row out front and a chain-link fence wrapped around the lot, sweat had broken out across Danny's forehead despite the cold. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. A man stood near the gate, arms crossed, leather vest heavy with patches, watching him approach with narrowed eyes. Danny walked right up to him before his nerve could fail. He pulled the wallet from his jacket and held it out. "This isn't mine," he said. Then he turned and started walking away, fast, his shoes slapping against the pavement. Behind him, he heard the man call out, voice rough with surprise. "Hey, wait a second, kid!" Danny didn't stop. He didn't look back. He kept walking, faster now, until the sound of the man's voice faded behind him, and the road stretched out empty and gray in front of him once more. Bear got back to the clubhouse a little after 7, tired and cold, his gloves stiff with dried grease from a delivery run that had taken twice as long as it should have. He was thinking about nothing more than a hot plate of food, and maybe 3 hours of sleep before he had to be up again. That was before Tank met him at the door with a look on his face that stopped Bear cold before he even got his helmet off. "You're not going to believe this," Tank said. Bear set his helmet down on the bench by the door. "Try me." Some kid showed up at the gate this afternoon. Skinny thing, looked half-starved. Walked right up to Rico and handed over a wallet, said, "This isn't mine," and then took off before Rico could get a word in. Bear frowned. "A wallet. Your wallet, Bear." For a second, Bear didn't understand. Then his hand went to his back pocket out of pure reflex, and he found nothing there but the seam of his jeans. He'd noticed it missing that morning at the gas station outside of Millbrook, patted himself down twice, cursed under his breath, and figured he'd dropped it somewhere between the pumps and his bike. 40 miles of road since then. He'd written it off as gone. Cash and all. "Where is it now?" Bear said. Tank nodded toward the office. "Rico's got it. Nobody's touched it. We figured that was your call." Bear walked into the little back office where Rico kept the books and found the wallet sitting square in the middle of the desk, like it might be evidence in a trial. He picked it up. The leather was the same worn brown it had always been, soft at the corners from years in his pocket. He turned it over once, feeling the familiar weight of it, and something in his chest went tight and suspicious. "Anybody follow the kid? Find out who he is?" Rico said he took off running, said he looked homeless, torn jacket, no gloves, that kind of thing. Tank shrugged. "Didn't want anything for it either. Wouldn't even give his name." Bear didn't say much after that. He took the wallet home to the small house he kept on the edge of town, the one with the empty rooms and the quiet that never used to bother him until the last few years crept up and made the silence feel like something with teeth. He sat down at his kitchen table under the one good light bulb over the sink and set the wallet down in front of him, like it was something that might still bite. His first thought was that it was a setup. Had to be. Somebody trying to work an angle, maybe soften him up before asking for a favor, or planting doubt so they could accuse him later of coming up short and claim he owed them somehow. Bear had been around long enough to know that nothing came free, and nothing came without a reason behind it. A homeless kid walking 2 miles out of his way to hand back a wallet full of cash didn't make sense in any world Bear had ever lived in. So he counted it. Slow and careful, the way he'd count out payroll or club dues, laying each bill flat on the table in neat stacks, 20s, then 50s, then the few hundreds tucked in the back fold. He counted it once, then again just to be sure his tired eyes weren't playing tricks on him. $2,940, every dollar he remembered having, not a bill missing, not a bill added. He checked the photograph next, the one of Marie tucked behind his license, the corners soft with age, untouched, not even smudged. Bear sat back in his chair and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He should have felt relieved. That was the natural thing, the sensible thing. He had his money back, every cent of it, more than he'd had any right to expect. But relief wasn't what settled over him as he sat there in the quiet kitchen with the wallet open in front of him and the single bulb humming overhead. What he felt instead was unsettled, off balance, like something didn't add up even though the math did. A homeless kid, cold and hungry by the look of him, had held $3,000 in his hands and walked away from it without taking a single bill. Bear stared at the wallet a long time. Then he made up his mind. He needed to find that kid. He needed to understand why. The morning came up gray and cold, the kind of cold that got into a man's joints and stayed there. Bear hadn't slept much. He'd sat up half the night with that wallet on the table, turning the same questions over in his head until they wore smooth and still didn't make sense. By 6, he gave up on sleep altogether, pulled on his jacket, and rode out to Marge's diner with his breath fogging inside his helmet. The diner sat off Route 9 like it had been there since the beginning of time, a squat building with a flickering sign and windows steamed up from the griddle inside. Bear parked his bike near the door and walked in, the bell above it jingling loud in the mostly empty room. Just a couple of truckers hunched over coffee in a back booth, and Rita behind the counter, wiping down the same 6 feet of counter she'd probably wiped 100 times already that morning. She looked up when he came in, and something in her face told Bear she already knew why he was there. "Bear," she said, careful. "Coffee?" "In a minute." He sat down at the counter, took his gloves off finger by finger, laid them down neat. "I need to ask you something, Rita, and I need you to be straight with me." She set the rag down. "I figured." "There a kid been hanging around here? Homeless kid. Skinny, maybe 18, 19. Torn jacket?" Rita didn't answer right away. She glanced toward the kitchen door, then back at Bear, and he could see her weighing something behind her eyes. Rita wasn't the kind of woman who gave things up easy, especially not people. She'd been feeding half the town off the books for 20 years and never said a word about it to anybody. "Why do you want to know?" she said. "He did something yesterday, something I need to understand." "He in trouble?" "No." Bear said it firm, met her eyes so she'd know he meant it. "Just the opposite, if you want to know the truth." Rita studied him a long moment, the way a woman studies a man she's known enough years to trust his word, but not enough to hand over somebody vulnerable without a fight. Finally, she let out a breath and untied her apron string, just fidgeting with it. "His name's Danny," she said. "Reyes, I think. He's been sleeping out back, behind the tree line, must be going on 8 months now. Doesn't ask for much. I give him what's left over some mornings. He washes dishes for me sometimes. Won't take money for it, just food." She shook her head. "That boy's got more pride than sense, if you ask me." "Where exactly?" Rita pointed with her chin toward the back window, past the dumpsters, toward the dark line of trees behind the lot. "Follow the path past the propane tanks. You'll see it. Just go easy, Bear. He's not like the trouble you're used to. He's just a kid trying to get by." Bear nodded once, put his gloves back on, and left his coffee untouched. The path behind the diner was rough, half-frozen mud and old gravel, and it took him past the propane tanks and into the tree line where the morning light barely made it through the bare branches. He found the tent maybe 50 yards in, a sorry thing, blue tarp gone gray with dirt, one corner sagging where a pole had bent. It looked like it had been patched more than once. Bear stood outside it for a second, feeling suddenly like a man who didn't know what to do with his hands. Then he crouched down and knocked on the tarp like it was a door. "Kid, you in there?" There was a rustle, then the flap pulled back, and there was Danny, blinking against the light, hair flat on one side from sleep, jacket zipped up to his chin. He looked younger than Bear expected, and thinner, with dark circles under his eyes that no 18-year-old should have. Recognition crossed his face fast, then wariness right behind it. Bear reached into his jacket and pulled out a 20, held it out flat on his palm. "For yesterday," he said. "That took guts, what you did. Figured you earned something for it." Danny looked at the bill, didn't reach for it. "I don't want your money," he said, quiet but steady. "I didn't give it back because I wanted something for it. I did it because it wasn't mine to keep." Bear held the 20 out a second longer, waiting for the kid to change his mind. Danny didn't move, didn't blink, just held Bear's eyes with a kind of quiet certainty that didn't waver. Bear lowered his hand slowly and studied the boy's face, the thin jaw set tight, the eyes clear and unashamed. It had been a long time since Bear had seen anything that honest looking back at him. He didn't say another word. He turned, walked back down the path, and rode off without looking back. The clubhouse sat at the edge of town, a squat building with steel shutters and a gravel lot full of bikes lined up neat as teeth in a comb. By evening, the place had filled with the low rumble of voices, the smell of cigarette smoke and reheated chili, and the clatter of pool balls from the back room. Bear walked in still wearing his riding jacket, and something in the way he moved made a few heads turn. Tank was first to notice. He was leaning against the bar, arms like tree trunks crossed over his chest, watching Bear with the kind of squint that said he'd already guessed something was off. "You look like a man who saw a ghost," Tank said. Bear pulled out a stool and sat down heavy. "Not a ghost? A kid." That got attention. Preacher, sitting in the corner with a paperback Bible on his knee, closed the book slow and leaned forward. A few other members drifted closer, drawn by the change in Bear's voice, the way he wasn't talking loud like usual. "You all heard about the wallet," Bear said. "Found it gone yesterday morning at Marge's. Figured somebody lifted it clean, $3,000 and all. Then last night some skinny kid walks right up to the clubhouse gate and hands it back. Every dollar in it." A murmur went around the room. Someone let out a low whistle. "Wallet like that," Tank said. "Kid could have disappeared with it. Nobody would have known different." "That's what I thought," Bear said. "So today I went and found him. Rita over at the diner told me he's been sleeping in a tent behind the tree line, going on 8 months now, 18 years old. Aged out of foster care, near as I can tell. No family, nothing. The room had gone quiet enough that the pool balls in the back stopped clacking. Somebody had turned the jukebox down without asking. I gave the kid a 20, Bear went on. Figured it was the least I could do, thank him proper. Kid wouldn't take it." Bear paused, remembering the boy's face, that steady, clear look that hadn't wavered even once. "Told me straight out he didn't do it for money. Said it wasn't his to keep, plain as that." Preacher's eyebrows lifted slow. "Turned down cash. A homeless kid." "That's what I said." "That's a load of something," one of the younger members, Ricky, muttered from near the pool table. "Nobody's that clean. He's playing an angle. Probably figures if he plays it slow, we cough up more later." A few heads nodded at that, the old suspicion creeping back in, the kind that came from years of getting burned by people who smiled pretty and lied prettier. Bear didn't argue right away. He let the doubt sit a second, because he understood it. He'd felt it himself, sitting up half the night with that money on the table. "Maybe," Bear said finally. "But I looked that kid in the eye. 8 months out there in the cold, nothing to his name, and he hands back $3,000 and won't even take a 20 for himself." He shook his head. "I've known grown men who wouldn't have done that with a gun to their head." Tank was quiet a moment, chewing on that. "Where's he sleeping again?" "Behind Marge's, tree line past the propane tanks." Nobody said much after that. But something had shifted in the room, the kind of thing that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. Preacher opened his Bible back up but didn't read it. Ricky went back to his pool game, but his shots were sloppier than before, like his mind had wandered somewhere else. By the next morning, word had gotten around the whole chapter, the way things always did in a place like that. Passed brother to brother over coffee and cigarettes until everybody had heard some version of the story. And one by one, bikes started rolling out toward Marge's diner. Tank showed up first with a box of donuts and an old flannel jacket that still smelled like his garage. Preacher came next, quiet as ever, carrying a thermos of soup his sister had made. Others trickled in through the morning, leaving behind cash on the tent floor that Danny kept trying to hand back, food he accepted only after they insisted twice. 3 times. Rita stood behind the diner counter, rag forgotten in her hand, staring out the steamed-up window at the site in her back lot. A dozen leather-clad men, the same men half the town crossed the street to avoid, crouched low around a boy's ragged tent, like they were kneeling at something sacred. She'd never seen anything like it in all her years running that diner, and she wasn't sure she ever would again. A week later, Bear drove out to see Diesel's widow. Her name was Carol, and she lived in a small house at the edge of town with a sagging porch and a yard full of kids' bikes. Diesel had been a member for almost 20 years, a big man with a bigger laugh, gone now because his heart had given out in his sleep, quiet and sudden, the way some men just stop being there one day without any warning at all. Bear had come by to check on her, the way the club always did for the families they left behind. He sat at her kitchen table while she poured coffee with hands that shook just a little, and the 3 kids ran around in the next room, too young yet to understand that their father wasn't coming back. "I don't know how we would have done it," Carol said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "The funeral, all of it. Diesel never had 2 dimes saved. You know how he was. Always giving it away to somebody who needed it more." Bear nodded slow, not sure where this was going. "That's why I was so grateful when Tank came by with the money," Carol went on. "Near $3,000, right when I needed it most. Told me the club had been collecting it, passing the hat around at the last few meetings. Said it was for the burial." She smiled, small and tired. "I don't know what we would have done without you boys." Bear felt something cold drop through his chest, like a stone falling into water. He set his coffee cup down, careful, like it might shatter if he wasn't gentle with it. "The money in the wallet," he said slow. "That was for Diesel's funeral?" Carol nodded, not noticing the change in his voice. "Every dollar of it. Tank said you all had been passing donations around for weeks. Guess it just made sense somebody was carrying it around, collecting from the guys who couldn't make the last meeting." Bear sat there a long moment, quiet, doing the math in his head, and it landed heavier than a fist. That money in his wallet hadn't just been his own cash he'd been careless with. It had been the whole club's grief and love, pooled together dollar by dollar, meant to bury a brother and keep his kids fed a little longer. And Danny, that skinny kid sleeping in a torn tent with nothing to his name, had found it lying in the dirt and hadn't taken a single dollar. Not knowing what it was for. Not knowing it would have been near impossible to trace back to him if he'd walked off with it into the night and never looked back. He'd been starving, freezing. 8 months with nothing, and here was $3,000 just sitting there, and the boy walked 2 miles in the cold to give it back to men the whole town was scared of. Bear thanked Carol for the coffee, told her to call if she needed anything, and got back on his bike. But he didn't ride to the clubhouse. He rode out to the edge of town instead, past Marge's, and sat on his bike a long while, engine off, just watching the last light go orange and pink over the tree line where Danny's tent still sat. That night, Bear sat alone in his apartment, the television off, a beer going warm and untouched on the table beside him. He kept turning it over and over in his mind, unable to shake it loose. A kid with nothing. A kid who'd been let down by every adult he'd ever known, tossed through the system like some parcel nobody wanted to claim. And that kid had held $3,000 in his hands, enough to get him off the street, enough to get him a warm bed and hot food for months, and he'd given it all back without asking a single question. Bear thought about all the men he'd known in his life, grown men with money in the bank and roofs over their heads, who wouldn't have done the same. He thought of himself at 18, angry at the world, taking whatever he could get his hands on because nobody had ever shown him different. Somebody had shown Danny different. Or maybe nobody had, and the kid had figured it out all on his own, which made it even harder to sit with. Bear rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it settle deep into his bones. A thank you wasn't going to cut it. Not for this. Not for a kid who'd given back that much when he had that little. He sat there in the dark a long while, the quiet pressing in around him, until finally he said it out loud to nobody but himself. I owe that boy more than a 20. He didn't know yet what that meant, or how he'd do it. But he knew, sitting there in the dark with his heart heavy and his mind made up, that he wasn't walking away from this. Not now, not after what he'd learned. The morning came in gray and cold, with a thin mist hanging low over the road. Bear hadn't slept much. He'd lain awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, running the same thought through his head over and over until it wore a groove there. By the time the sun came up weak and pale behind the clouds, he'd already made his decision. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his jacket, and headed out to his bike. The ride to Marge's diner felt longer than usual, though the distance hadn't changed. Bear kept both hands steady on the handlebars, but his mind kept drifting back to Carol's kitchen table, to the sound of her voice when she said, "Near $3,000, right when I needed it most." When he pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner, he spotted Danny right away through the propped-open back door. The boy stood at a big steel sink, sleeves pushed up past his elbows, scrubbing a stack of pans that looked taller than he was. Steam rose up around his face. His shoulders moved in steady, careful motions, the kind of work a person did when they were trying to prove something, even if nobody was watching. Bear cut the engine and sat there a minute, just looking. Rita came to the door with a rag in her hand and gave him a nod, like she already knew something had shifted, though she couldn't have said what. Bear nodded back and climbed off his bike. He walked up slow, boots crunching on the gravel, and leaned against the doorframe. Danny didn't notice him at first, too busy working a burnt patch off the bottom of a pan. When he finally looked up, his whole body went still, like a rabbit spotting a hawk. "Morning," Bear said. Danny wiped his hands on his jeans, wary. "Morning." Bear watched him a moment longer, taking in the hollows under his eyes, the way his ribs showed a little too much through his thin shirt. "You're good at that," Bear said, nodding at the pans. Danny shrugged. "Rita lets me eat if I wash up after the morning rush." "That's a fair trade," Bear said, "but I got a better one if you want to hear it." Danny's eyes narrowed, just slightly. Bear could see the calculation running behind them, the same calculation Bear figured had kept this kid alive the past 8 months, weighing every offer for the trap that might be hiding inside it. "I run the clubhouse garage," Bear said. "It's a mess. Been a mess for years, if I'm honest. I need somebody to clean it up, sweep the floors, organize the tools, that kind of thing. I'll pay you for it. Real pay, not just table scraps. And you eat with us while you're there. Hot meals, not diner leftovers." Danny didn't say anything right away. He set the pan down slow in the sink, like he needed a second to keep his hands busy while his mind worked through it. "Why?" Danny asked finally. Bear could have given him some smooth answer, something easy that slid right past the truth. But he figured the kid had earned better than that. "Because you did something most grown men wouldn't have done," Bear said. "And I don't forget things like that." Danny's jaw tightened. Bear could see him bracing, the way a person braces when they've been burned too many times by things that sounded good and turned out rotten underneath. "I don't need charity," Danny said quietly. "Wouldn't call it that," Bear said. "It's work. You clean, you get paid. Simple as that." The diner hummed around them, the clatter of forks and cups, Rita's voice calling out an order somewhere near the counter. Danny looked down at his hands, red and raw from the hot water, and then back up at Bear, searching his face like he was trying to find the catch, the hook buried somewhere in the bait. He didn't find one. Or maybe he did, and decided the hunger was bigger than the fear. "Okay," Danny said, quiet. "I'll do it." Bear nodded, careful not to let too much show on his face, though something in his chest eased a little. "Good. Come by whenever you're ready." Danny watched him walk back to his bike, boots crunching gravel, engine roaring to life and then fading down the road. He stood there a long moment after Bear was gone, drying his hands on his shirt, the offer sitting strange and heavy in his chest, too good to trust completely. That afternoon, he walked back to the tent behind the tree line, the only home he'd known in 8 months. He knelt down and gathered his few things, a worn blanket, a cracked phone charger, a photograph of his mother folded soft at the edges. He packed them slow into his backpack, then stood and looked back once at the trees, wondering if he was making a mistake. The clubhouse sat back off the main road, a long, low building of cinder block and corrugated metal, with a gravel lot out front crowded with motorcycles lined up in neat rows, like soldiers standing at attention. Danny stood at the edge of the lot, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and felt his stomach twist into a hard knot. There were so many bikes. Chrome caught the morning light and threw it back sharp enough to hurt his eyes. Behind them, the garage doors stood open, and inside he could see shapes moving, big men in leather vests, some bent over engines, some standing around talking low. A couple of them looked up when he came closer, their eyes tracking him the way a dog tracks something it hasn't decided is safe yet. Danny made himself keep walking. His mother's voice was in his head again, telling him to stand up straight, to not let his fear show even when it was eating him alive. "You must be the kid," a voice said. Danny turned and found himself looking up at a wall of a man. Tank was built like something meant to move heavy things, arms thick as fence posts, a beard that hid most of his face except for 2 sharp eyes that studied Danny without any meanness in them, just plain assessment. "Danny," he said, and held out his hand. Tank looked at it a second, then shook it. His grip was gentle, careful, like he knew his own strength and didn't want to use all of it. "Tank," he said, "Bear says you're here to clean up my mess." "I guess so," Danny said. Tank barked out a laugh, short and rough. "Come on then, I'll show you around." The inside of the garage smelled like motor oil and rubber, a smell that reminded Danny a little of the auto shop class he'd taken for 1 semester before the school lost track of which foster home he was supposed to be living in. Tools hung crooked on pegboards, some in the wrong slots, some not hung up at all. Parts sat scattered across workbenches, some labeled, some not. It was a mess, just like Bear had said, but Danny found himself looking at it less like a mess and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Broom's over there," Tank said, pointing. "Sweep the floor first, all the way to the back. Then I want you sorting those bolts and washers by size. They've been dumped together in that bucket for I don't know how long. After that, there's parts that need degreasing. I'll show you the solvent and the rags. Take your time. Do it right, not fast." Okay, Danny said. Tank studied him a second longer, like he was waiting for some kind of complaint or excuse. When none came, he just nodded and went back to the engine he'd been working on before Danny arrived. Danny picked up the broom and got to work. He swept slow and careful, working the dust and grit into neat piles, then out the door into the lot. A few of the other members wandered past throughout the morning, some nodding at him, some just watching. But nobody said much. Danny kept his head down and his hands busy, the way he'd learned to do in every foster home that ever passed him through its doors. Work hard. Stay quiet. Don't give anybody a reason to notice you in a bad way. By midday, the floor was clean enough to eat off of, and Danny moved on to the bucket of bolts and washers, sorting them into old coffee cans by size, the metal clinking soft and steady in his hands. It was mindless work, but it felt good, felt like something he could control when so much of his life had been out of his hands. Tank came by around noon, took one look at the sorted cans, then at the swept floor, and grunted something that might have been approval. Not bad, he said. Keep going. Danny kept going. He moved on to the parts needing degreasing, scrubbing at old grime with a rag soaked in solvent until his fingers ached and his knuckles turned raw. But he didn't stop, didn't slow down, worked through the ache the way he'd worked through worse. The afternoon light slanted long through the garage windows by the time Tank called it. Come eat, he said, and Danny realized his stomach had been growling for the last hour without him noticing, too focused on the work to pay it any mind. 2 weeks passed like this, Danny showing up before the sun cleared the tree line when the gravel lot was still empty and quiet, except for a few birds calling from the power lines. He'd sit on the step outside the garage door and wait, not wanting to seem like he was pushing his way in until Tank or somebody else showed up to unlock things. By the 3rd day, Tank started leaving the door unlocked for him. Danny took that small thing and held on to it like it meant something bigger than it probably did. His days fell into a rhythm. Sweep first. Then whatever needed doing, whether it was sorting parts or wiping down tools or hauling trash out to the bins behind the building. He never waited to be told twice. If he saw something that needed fixing, he fixed it. And if he wasn't sure how, he asked, quiet and careful. The way you'd ask a question you were scared might get you yelled at. Nobody yelled at him. Not once. Tank started showing him things during the slow parts of the afternoon, when the work eased up and the garage got that lazy, warm feeling of men who'd been on their feet too long. He showed Danny how to check oil, how to read the wear on a tire, how to listen to an engine and hear what it was trying to tell you before it broke down on some highway 50 miles from anywhere. Most people don't listen, Tank said, wiping his hands on a rag. They just want to go fast and not think about what's happening under them. Bike don't work that way. Bike's got a voice if you pay attention. Danny paid attention. He picked things up fast, faster than Tank seemed to expect, and there was a particular kind of pride in the way Tank would grunt and shake his head after Danny got something right on the first try. You sure you never done this before? Tank asked one afternoon, watching Danny adjust a chain tension without being told twice how. No, Danny said, just watching you. Well, Tank said, and didn't finish the sentence, just nodded like that settled something. Danny started to let himself feel something close to good during those hours. Not happy, not yet. That word still felt too big and too risky to reach for. But something. A kind of quiet in his chest that hadn't been there before. It was a Thursday evening when that quiet got interrupted. The sun had gone down already, and most of the members had cleared out for the night, headed home or off to wherever they went when the garage closed up. Danny was in the back, coiling a hose that had gotten tangled during the day, and he heard voices drift in from just outside the open bay door. Two men he recognized but didn't know well, talking low, the kind of low that people use when they think nobody's listening. "Still don't know about him," one of them was saying. "Kid shows up out of nowhere and now he's basically living here." "He returned Bear's wallet," the other one said. "Every dollar." "I get that, I do. But that don't mean he's gonna stick. Kids like that, no family, no roots, they drift. One day he's here, next day something better comes along and he's gone, and Bear's out here acting like he found himself a son. You don't know that. I don't know the opposite either." Danny stood very still, the hose forgotten in his hands. He wasn't sure why the words landed as hard as they did. He'd heard worse from people who were supposed to love him. He'd heard worse from actual family, but something about it here, in this place that had started to feel almost safe, hurt in a way he hadn't braced for. He didn't move until the voices faded, footsteps crunching off across the gravel toward the parking lot, engines starting up somewhere in the dark. He set the hose down slow. Didn't say anything, didn't argue, didn't even feel angry. Not really. Just a familiar, tired kind of hurt, the kind that settled into his chest like an old friend he wished would stop visiting. He thought about his mother's voice again, the one that used to tell him people would doubt him, that people would always find some reason not to trust something they didn't understand. "The only thing you can do," she used to say, "is keep being who you are and let your hands do the talking your mouth can't." So Danny picked the hose back up and finished coiling it. Then he swept the floor again, even though it was already clean. He straightened the tools on the pegboard, checked the cans of bolts, wiped down the workbench one more time. The garage sat empty and quiet around him, the only sound his own movements and the hum of the single bulb overhead. And Danny worked long after everyone else had gone home, because it was the only answer he knew how to give. Danny found a spot at the edge of the picnic table behind the clubhouse, a paper plate of beans and cornbread in front of him, when Preacher's shadow fell across the wood. "Mind some company?" Danny looked up, surprised. Preacher was older than most of the other men, with a gray beard that reached halfway down his chest and eyes that always seemed to be looking a little past you, like he was thinking about something far away. He didn't wait for an answer. He just sat down across from Danny, setting his own plate down with a grunt. "Tank tells me you got a good eye for engines," Preacher said, digging his fork into his beans. "I'm just learning," Danny said. "That's how everybody starts." Preacher chewed slow, looking out at the tree line where the sun was starting to dip. "I remember when I first showed up here, must be 20-some years back now, didn't know a spark plug from a screwdriver. Bear's daddy was running the chapter then, God rest him. Man scared me half to death." Danny almost smiled at that. It was hard to imagine anybody scaring Preacher. "I wasn't in a good place back then," Preacher went on. "Drinking too much, lost my job, lost my wife, was sleeping in my truck for a stretch, if you can believe that. This club, these men, they didn't have to give me a chance. But they did." Danny's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You slept in your truck?" 6 months, Preacher said, not making a big deal of it. "Wasn't proud of it, but I learned something out there. Learned who you are when nobody's handing you nothing is who you really are." He looked at Danny then, steady and calm. "You know something about that? I'd guess." Danny looked down at his plate. "Yeah." "You don't gotta tell me anything you don't want to," Preacher said, "but I got 2 ears that ain't doing much else right now." Danny was quiet for a long moment. The evening bugs had started up in the grass, and somewhere behind them a radio was playing low. "I was in 8 different homes," Danny finally said. "Foster homes. Some of them were okay. Some weren't." 8, Preacher repeated. Not with pity, just taking it in. Last one, the lady had 4 other kids besides me. She wasn't mean, just tired all the time. I don't think she ever learned my name right, she just called me Hun, like she called everybody. Danny picked at the cornbread, breaking off a piece he didn't eat. Turned 18 and that was it. Nobody comes looking for you after that. You just age out, like milk going bad. Preacher didn't say anything right away. He let the words sit there in the evening air, like he was giving them room to breathe. "That why you flinch?" he asked eventually, gentle as anything. "I seen you do it. Couple weeks back, when Tank and Marco got into it over that transmission. You went stiff as a board." Danny felt his face go warm, embarrassed to have been noticed. "Yeah," he admitted. "Loud voices, arguing, it does something to me. I know people are just talking, blowing off steam, but my body doesn't always know that." "Makes sense," Preacher said. "You spend your whole life waiting for the yelling to turn into something worse. Your body learns to brace for it. That ain't a flaw, son. That's just what surviving looks like." Danny nodded slow, throat tight. "I never really belonged anywhere," he said, quiet. "Every place I lived, I knew I was just passing through. Didn't matter how long I stayed, it never felt like mine. Never felt like I was anybody's either." Preacher was quiet again. But it wasn't an empty kind of quiet. It was the kind that meant he was really hearing him. "I'm gonna tell you something," Preacher said finally, "and I need you to hear it, even if you don't believe it yet. This club, we take care of our own. Don't matter how you found your way to us. Don't matter that you didn't grow up wearing a patch or riding a bike. You returned Bear's money when you had nothing, and you kept showing up here with nothing but your 2 hands and your word. That's what makes you one of ours." Danny looked at him, unsure what to do with the words, like they were a gift too big for his hands to hold. He didn't say anything back. He just nodded, small and careful, and looked down at his plate. Bear found Danny the next morning, elbow deep in the guts of an old carburetor, a rag hanging out of his back pocket like it had grown there. The garage smelled like oil and metal, and dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the high windows. Danny didn't hear him come in at first. He was too focused, turning a small part over in his fingers, checking it against a diagram torn from one of the library books he kept in a milk crate by his cot. "You've been sleeping back there a month now," Bear said. Danny looked up, wiping his hands on the rag. "Almost 6 weeks," he said. "I've been counting." Bear grunted, something that might have been amusement. He walked over slow, looking around at the cot in the corner, the neatly folded blanket, the crate of books stacked like they were precious cargo. Danny kept the space clean. Cleaner than most men Bear knew kept their own houses. "There's a room upstairs," Bear said, "above the clubhouse. Used to be for storage, but Tank and Marco cleared it out a while back, thinking maybe one of the prospects would want it. Nobody's used it." Danny set the carburetor part down carefully on the workbench. "Okay," he said, not sure where this was going. "It's got a bed. Real one, not a cot. Window that actually opens. Little bit bigger than a closet, but bigger than what you got here." Bear crossed his arms, watching Danny's face. "I'm saying you should move in there." Danny blinked. For a second, he didn't say anything at all. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner, where they kept sodas for anybody working late. "Why?" Danny finally asked. "Why not?" Bear said. "Because." Danny looked down at his hands, at the grease stuck under his fingernails that never seemed to fully come out anymore. "Because people don't just give things away, not for nothing. There's always a reason, and the reason's not usually good." Bear didn't get angry at that. He'd expected something like it. He leaned against the workbench, arms still crossed, and looked at Danny with the same steady patience Preacher had shown him the night before. "I'm not giving you nothing," Bear said. "You've been out here every day for 6 weeks. You fixed Tank's brake line. You organized this whole garage so a man can actually find a wrench when he needs one. You cook for the brothers most nights without anybody asking you to. You think that room's charity? That room is you earning your keep, same as anybody else who works here." Danny's jaw tightened. He looked away, out toward the open garage door where the morning light was spilling in gold and thin. "I've heard that before," he said, quiet. "People saying they want to help. Foster families saying this time it'll be different. Caseworkers saying they found me a good placement." His voice cracked just slightly, and he pressed his lips together like he was trying to hold something in. "It's never different. Something always happens. They get tired of you, or things fall apart, or you just find out it was never really about you at all." Bear was quiet a moment, letting the words land the way Preacher had taught him to, without rushing to fill the silence. "I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen," Bear said finally. "I'd be lying if I did. But I can tell you this. Every man in this clubhouse has watched you work, watched you refuse money you didn't earn, watched you take care of things that weren't even your job to take care of. That's not something we're making up to be nice. That's something you did. Nobody can take that away from you, and nobody's going to go back on it." Danny looked at him for a long moment, something raw and uncertain moving behind his eyes. He looked like he wanted to believe it so badly it hurt. "Okay," Danny said finally, the word coming out small. Bear nodded, like that settled it, and didn't make a show of it. "Bring your stuff up whenever you're ready." It didn't take Danny long. He didn't have much. The milk crate of library books, a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, the blanket off the cot that Rita had given him back when he was still sleeping behind the diner. He carried it all up the narrow staircase behind the clubhouse himself, refusing help when Marco offered. The room was small, just like Bear said, but it was clean, with a real bed pushed against the wall and a window that looked out over the tree line. Danny set the crate down at the foot of the bed and stood there for a moment, looking around at the 4 walls that were, for now at least, his. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, feeling the give of real springs beneath him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, something in his chest loosened. It wasn't trust yet. Not all the way. But it was something close to safety, and it was the first time in years he'd let himself feel it. The lunch rush at Marge's diner had thinned out to just a few stragglers by the time Danny walked in that afternoon. He'd come to pick up a part Rita had been holding for him, something Tank needed for a bike in the garage. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the smell of fried onions and coffee hit him the way it always did, familiar now in a way that still surprised him. He heard the shouting before he saw what was happening. Near the back, by the swinging door to the kitchen, a heavyset man in a trucker cap was leaning over the counter, jabbing a finger at a boy who couldn't have been older than 16. The boy wore a stained apron and held a rag in his shaking hands. His name was Miguel. Danny had seen him around before, quiet kid, always scrubbing pots in the back, never saying much to anybody. "I asked for it well done," the trucker was saying, loud enough that the few other customers had gone still in their booths. "You think I'm paying for this? Look at it. It's practically raw. Are you stupid or do you just not listen?" Miguel's face had gone red, his eyes down on the floor. He mumbled something that sounded like an apology, but the man cut him off. "I don't want your sorry. I want it fixed. And maybe if you weren't so busy standing around like an idiot, you'd get things right the first time." Rita was at the register, watching with a tight jaw, clearly ready to step in. But Danny got there first. He set the part down on an empty table and walked over, slow and calm, the same way he approached a scared dog or a customer with too much attitude. "Hey," Danny said, his voice even. "He's not the one who took your order. That was the waitress. He's just the dishwasher. He probably didn't even see the ticket." The trucker turned, sizing Danny up. "Who asked you?" "Nobody," Danny said. "But you're yelling at a kid for something that's not his fault. And it's not going to get you a better burger. It's just going to make you feel like a big man for a minute." The diner had gone completely quiet. Rita's hand had frozen on the counter. Miguel looked up at Danny like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The trucker's face reddened, and for a second, Danny thought the man might take a swing. But Danny didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't puff himself up the way some men might have. He just stood there, steady, waiting. "You want it fixed? I'll fix it myself," Danny said. "Give me 2 minutes." He walked around the counter, grabbed the plate, and disappeared into the kitchen. Rita followed him with her eyes, stunned. A few minutes later, Danny came back out with a fresh plate, the burger cooked through, and set it down in front of the man without a word. The trucker looked at it, looked at Danny, and muttered something under his breath before digging in. He didn't apologize. But he didn't yell anymore either, and after he finished eating, he left a 5 on the table and walked out without looking back. Miguel came around the counter later, wiping his hands on his apron, and said quietly, "Thanks." Danny just nodded. "Don't let guys like that get in your head. It's not about you." That evening, Bear stopped by the diner for coffee, same as he did most days now. Rita leaned on the counter across from him, arms crossed, a look on her face he hadn't seen before, something between pride and disbelief. "You should have seen your boy today," she said. Bear raised an eyebrow. "What did he do?" Rita told him the whole thing, the trucker, Miguel shaking behind the counter, Danny stepping in without raising his voice once, standing his ground like a man twice his age. Bear sat there quiet for a moment after she finished, turning his coffee cup slowly on the counter. Something warm settled in his chest, something that felt a lot like pride, though it caught him off guard how deep it ran. This wasn't just some kid he was doing a favor for anymore. This was somebody worth knowing, somebody with a spine of steel wrapped up in all that quiet. He thought about all the months Danny had been around now, and how little he actually knew about where the boy had come from. No family, no mention of parents, siblings, anyone at all. Bear set his cup down and decided it was time to find out why. The clubhouse kitchen smelled like coffee gone bitter on the burner and the leftover grease from whatever tank had fried up for dinner. Bear sat at the scarred wooden table, 2 mugs in front of him, steam curling up from both. Danny sat across from him, still in his work clothes, a smear of grease on his forearm he hadn't bothered to wipe off. "Long day," Bear said, sliding one of the mugs over. Danny wrapped his hands around it but didn't drink. "Rita tell you about the diner thing?" "She did." Bear studied him for a second. "You did good." Danny shrugged like it was nothing, but a small light flickered behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being told that. Bear turned his own mug slowly, working up to something. He wasn't a man who talked much about feelings, and he wasn't good at easing into hard questions, so he just asked it straight. "You ever tell me about your family? Where you came from before all this?" Danny's shoulders went stiff. He looked down at the table, tracing a scratch in the wood with his thumbnail. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and Bear didn't push. He'd learned that much about the kid already. Push too hard, and he'd shut the door completely. "Not much to tell," Danny finally said. "Mom died when I was 7. Never knew my dad. After that, I went into the system, bounced around a lot." "No other family? Aunts, uncles, grandparents?" Danny's jaw tightened. He was quiet again, longer this time. Bear waited, There was a grandmother, Danny said finally, voice low. Eleanor, my mom's mom. I don't remember much about her. I was really little. What happened to her? Danny's hands tightened around the mug. She didn't want me. After my mom died, I guess she could have taken me in. She didn't. I ended up in foster care instead. He said it flat, like a fact he'd repeated to himself so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone. Bear kept his face steady, though something in his chest twisted at the boy's tone. Not anger. Just old hurt, packed down so deep it had turned into something like acceptance. You remember anything else about her? Where she lived? Anything like that? Danny frowned, like he was digging through a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Small town. I think it started with an M. Millbrook, maybe. Somewhere upstate. I was real little when I went into the system, so it's foggy. Bear nodded slowly, filing it away without making a show of it. You ever try to find her? Look her up? Danny shook his head hard, almost before Bear finished the question. No. Never. Why not? Danny was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, quieter, more honest than before. Because if I looked, and I found her, and she still didn't want anything to do with me, I don't think I could take that. It's easier not knowing. At least right now I can tell myself maybe she had her reasons. If I find her and she slams the door in my face, there's no maybe anymore. It's just done. Bear didn't say anything for a moment. He understood that kind of fear better than Danny probably realized. The fear of finding out for certain that you weren't wanted. It was easier to live with a question than a confirmed answer that cut you open. That makes sense, Bear said quietly. Man doesn't go looking for a wound if he doesn't have to. Danny gave a small, tired smile. Grateful Bear didn't push further, didn't tell him he should go find her, didn't say any of the things people usually said when they didn't understand. They sat a while longer, talking about nothing much. The diner, the bike tank was fixing, until Danny finally stood, said goodnight, and headed up to the spare room above the clubhouse. Bear sat alone at the table for a long time after that, turning the name over in his head. Eleanor. Millbrook, or something close to it. Upstate. When Preacher wandered into the kitchen a little later, looking for the coffee pot, Bear waved him over and nodded at the empty chair across the table. Sit down, Bear said. I need to tell you something, and then I think you and me are going to do some digging. Preacher settled into the chair, coffee forgotten, and listened while Bear laid it all out. The grandmother. The town that started with an M. The 17 years of silence Danny carried like a stone in his gut. When Bear finished, Preacher rubbed his jaw, the gray stubble scratching under his palm. Millbrook, he said slowly. There's a Millbrook about 4 hours north of here. Small place. I had a cousin lived near there once. That's a start, Bear said. It's a start, Preacher agreed. But we gotta be careful, Bear. This ain't our story to go digging in without thinking it through. If we find her and she's exactly what Danny thinks she is, we could break that kid worse than he already is. Bear nodded. He'd already thought about that, turned it over more times than he wanted to admit. But the not knowing was eating at him, too. I gotta know, he said. One way or another. They started that same night. Preacher had a laptop older than some of the prospects in the club, and he pecked at the keys with 2 fingers, squinting through a pair of reading glasses he pretended he didn't need. Public records first. Property tax rolls for Millbrook, New York. It took almost an hour of dead ends before a name surfaced. Eleanor Reyes? Same last name as Danny's mother. A small house on Larchmont Street. Taxes paid every year like clockwork. No signs of the property ever changing hands. There she is, Preacher said, tapping the screen. Bear leaned in, staring at the name like it might vanish if he blinked. She's still there, after all this time. They kept at it through the week, working in stolen hours after the clubhouse quieted down, after Danny had gone up to bed thinking it was just another ordinary night. Bear called in a favor from an old brother named Cutter, who'd retired from the life years back, and now worked odd jobs doing skip tracing for a lawyer in Albany. Cutter didn't ask many questions. That was one of the good things about brothers who'd been around long enough. They knew when not to ask. Cutter came back 3 days later with more than they expected. Old case files, the kind that weren't supposed to be easy to get, but somehow always were if you knew who to call. What they found made Bear sit back in his chair like he'd been struck. The caseworker who handled Danny's file after his mother died was a woman named Diane Kessler. She'd been let go from the county 8 years ago after an internal review flagged a string of irregularities. Falsified records, missing paperwork, kids placed in homes without proper documentation, all while she pocketed extra stipends meant for foster families. And there, buried in the file, was the piece that made Bear's stomach turn. Eleanor Reyes had tried to get custody of Danny. Not once, several times. Kessler had told her, in writing, that the process had already gone forward without her, that Danny had been placed with an adoptive family overseas, a placement that couldn't be undone. Case closed. No further contact necessary. It was a lie. There was no overseas family. There never had been. Danny had been in the foster system the entire time, bounced from home to home less than 60 miles from where his grandmother sat every night, waiting for a phone call that was never going to come because someone decided it was easier to close a file than do the paperwork right. Preacher read it twice before he said anything. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, shaking his head slow. Bear couldn't speak for a long moment. He thought about Danny sitting in that kitchen, voice flat, saying, "She didn't want me," like it was a fact carved into stone. 17 years of a boy believing he wasn't wanted. And it had all been a lie some tired, careless woman told to close a folder faster. Cutter had dug up one more thing. A neighbor's statement, given years back during some kind of inquiry into Kessler's conduct, mentioning that Mrs. Reyes still kept a room ready. Bed made, toys on the shelf. She'd never stopped believing he might come home. Bear sat at the kitchen table long after Preacher had gone to bed, the laptop screen glowing in the dark, Eleanor's phone number sitting there on the page, waiting. He stared at it like it was something sacred and something dangerous all at once, unsure how a man was supposed to hold this much truth in his hands, without it shaking loose everything he thought he understood about broken families. The next morning, Bear called a meeting. Not the regular kind, where brothers filed in griping about the coffee and last week's ride schedule. This was different, and everyone who walked through the clubhouse door felt it in the way Bear stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. Tank came in first, wiping grease off his hands with a rag he stuffed in his back pocket. Then a handful of senior members, the ones who'd been patched in longest, the ones whose word carried weight when things needed deciding. Preacher took a seat near the window, laptop closed in front of him like a piece of evidence waiting to be presented. "This about the kid?" Tank asked, dropping into a chair. "It's about the kid," Bear said. He laid it out the same way Preacher had laid it out for him. The grandmother. The lie that had kept her and Danny apart for 17 years. The room she kept ready, bed made, waiting for a boy she never stopped believing would come home. The room went quiet when he finished. Real quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when grown men who don't cry are fighting the urge to. 17 years, one of the older members said, shaking his head. Some caseworker just closes the file and walks away, and that's it. That's a whole life gone sideways over some paperwork nobody bothered to check. "That's exactly it," Bear said. Tank leaned forward, elbows on the table. "So what are we doing about it?" Bear had been turning the idea over for 2 days, ever since Preacher found the phone number. It felt too big to say out loud, but he said it anyway. I want to bring him to her. Not just me and Preacher driving him up there quiet-like. I want to do it right. I want brothers from every chapter in the state riding with us. I want that kid to pull up to his grandmother's house with 350 men behind him, so he knows exactly what kind of family stood up for him when nobody else did. Nobody laughed. Nobody said it was too much. Kid gave back $3,000 he could have disappeared with, Tank said slowly. Money that would have saved him from freezing his tail off for a month. He didn't take a dime. That kind of character, that's rare. Man like that deserves more than a quiet drive upstate. One of the older members, a lifer named Gunner who rarely spoke unless it mattered, nodded once. We do this for our own funerals. We do it for weddings. Man returns a wallet full of cash to a stranger and it turns out he's got a grandmother crying herself to sleep every night for 17 years, waiting on a phone that never rings. That's worth every mile. Bear looked around the table. One by one, hands went up, not for a formal vote, just an understanding passing between them the way it always did, quiet and certain. Then it's settled, Bear said, but nobody says a word to Danny, not yet. Not till we know she wants this too. That night, Bear sat alone with the phone in his hand, staring at the number Cutter had dug up. His palms were sweating, which struck him as ridiculous for a man who'd faced down bar fights and cops and worse without blinking. But this felt different. This felt like it mattered more than any of that ever had. He dialed before he could talk himself out of it. It rang 3 times. Then a voice, soft and older, careful the way people get when they're not used to good news calling. Hello? Mrs. Reyes? My name's Bernard Coletti. I go by Bear. I'm calling about your grandson, Danny. There was a silence on the other end, so long Bear thought the call had dropped. Then he heard her breath catch. Danny, she whispered. My Danny? Yes, ma'am. He's alive. He's safe. He's a good young man, ma'am. One of the finest I've ever met. She started crying then, the kind of crying that came from somewhere so deep it didn't sound like it belonged to an old woman's voice. I never stopped, she said between sobs. 17 years, and I never stopped hoping. I kept his room. I kept it ready. Everyone told me to let go, and I never could. I know, Bear said, his own throat tightening. We know everything now. And ma'am, we'd like to bring him home to you, if that's something you want. Yes, she said, before he'd even finished. Yes, please. Bring my boy home. Danny felt it before he could name it. Something had shifted in the clubhouse, like the air pressure changed before a storm. It started small. He noticed Preacher on the phone in the corner of the garage, voice low, cupping the receiver like he didn't want to be overheard. When Danny walked by, Preacher ended the call fast and gave him a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything okay? Danny asked. Fine, fine, Preacher said. Just club business. But club business had never made Preacher's hands shake before. Then there was Tank, who usually barked orders and jokes in equal measure while they worked on the bikes, going quiet whenever Danny entered the room. Twice Danny caught him, and another member huddled over a laptop, and both times the screen snapped shut the second they noticed him standing there. What's going on? Danny asked one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag, trying to keep his voice light even though his stomach had knotted itself into something hard and cold. Nothing you need to worry about, Tank said, but he wouldn't meet Danny's eyes. By the 3rd day, Danny had convinced himself he'd done something wrong. He ran through everything in his head, every conversation, every task Bear had given him. Had he broken something in the garage? Said something out of line to one of the older members? He thought about the room above the clubhouse, the bed that was softer than anything he'd slept on in years, and wondered if it was about to be taken away. That was the thing about good things. Danny had learned a long time ago. They didn't last. Somebody always found a reason to take them back. He started sleeping less, lying awake, listening to the muffled sound of phone calls through the thin walls, brothers talking in tones too hushed to make out words, but urgent enough that he knew something big was happening, something that involved him, even though nobody would say so. He almost ran. The old instinct kicked in hard, the one that told him to grab his bag and disappear before anyone could throw him out first. It would hurt less that way, he told himself, if he left before they could tell him to go. But he thought of Bear's face the day he offered him the room. He thought of Preacher's stories, the quiet lessons buried inside them. He thought of Tank's rough hands guiding his over a wrench, showing him how to feel when something was tightened just right. These men hadn't lied to him yet. Not once. So Danny stayed. And on the fourth day, Bear found him in the garage, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at nothing. "Got a minute?" Bear asked. Danny's heart dropped straight to his shoes. Here it comes, he thought. "Sure," he said, standing up too fast, wiping his palms on his jeans. Bear led him to the small office off the main garage, the one with the cracked leather couch and the calendar nobody ever updated. He sat down across from Danny, and for a long moment he just looked at him, like he was trying to figure out the right way to start. "Danny," Bear said finally, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen, okay? All the way through." Danny nodded, throat tight. "Your grandmother," Bear said. "Eleanor. She didn't give you up. She never abandoned you." The words didn't make sense at first. Danny sat there, blinking, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part that would explain it away, the part that would make it hurt less. "There was a caseworker," Bear continued. "A bad one, and she told your grandmother you'd been adopted, sent overseas, told her there was no way to find you, no way to reach you. It was a lie, Danny, all of it. Your grandmother has been looking for you for 17 years. She kept your room ready. She never stopped believing you'd come home." Danny's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind scrambled to catch up with what his ears had just heard, and for a moment the whole world seemed to tilt sideways. 17 years of thinking he wasn't wanted. 17 years of carrying that weight like it was fact, like it was written into his bones. And now Bear was sitting there telling him it had all been wrong. A lie. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he couldn't cry yet. He couldn't do anything yet. He just sat there, frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the couch like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "Danny," Bear said softly. Danny finally looked up at him, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this true?" The next morning, Danny sat on the edge of his bed above the clubhouse, staring at the ceiling like it might have answers written on it somewhere. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a woman's face he'd never met, a face he'd built out of nothing but a word. Grandmother. He didn't even know what she looked like. He didn't know her voice, her laugh, whether she liked her coffee, sweet or bitter. All he had was a name and 17 years of empty space where a family should have been. He found Preacher in the garage, sitting on his usual stool by the workbench, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's Okayest Mechanic" in faded letters. Preacher looked up when Danny walked in, and seemed to know right away that something was sitting heavy on the kid. "Didn't sleep, huh?" Preacher said. It wasn't a question. Danny shook his head and sat down on the bucket across from him, the same one he'd been sitting on when Bear told him everything. "I don't know what to do," he said. "I don't know how to feel." Preacher set his mug down. "That's fair. That's a lot to carry all at once." Danny stared at his hands. They were still stained with grease from yesterday, little black lines in the creases of his knuckles. "What if I meet her?" he said slowly. "And it doesn't feel like anything? What if I've built this whole thing up in my head, this whole idea of what a grandmother is supposed to be, and then she's just a stranger?" He hadn't meant to say it that plainly, but once the words were out, more came tumbling after them. Or what if she looks at me and I'm not what she wanted? What if 17 years of imagining me turned into something better than I actually am, and I disappoint her the second she sees me? Preacher listened without interrupting, the way he always did, letting Danny's fear fill up the space between them until there wasn't anything left to say. "I've been let down before," Danny said, quieter now. "Every time I let myself hope for something, it gets taken away. I don't think I can survive hoping for this, and losing it too." Preacher nodded slowly, like he was turning something over in his mind, deciding how much of himself to hand over in return. "Let me tell you something," he said. "I had a brother once, younger than me by 4 years. We were close as kids, thick as thieves. Then I joined this life, and he didn't understand it. Thought I was throwing myself away. We had words, bad ones. Didn't speak for almost 20 years. Danny looked up at him. 20 years, Preacher said again, letting the number sit there. I used to tell myself I didn't care. Told myself it was easier that way, not hoping, not wondering. But that was a lie I told myself, so I wouldn't have to feel the missing him." He took a slow breath. "Then 3 years ago, I got a letter. He'd found out he was sick. Wanted to see me before it was too late." "Did you go?" Danny asked. "Almost didn't," Preacher admitted. "I was scared, same as you. Scared it'd be awkward. Scared he'd still be angry. Scared I'd show up and realize the brother I remembered was gone and there'd just be some old man left in his place who I didn't know how to talk to." "What happened?" Preacher smiled, small and warm. "I went. And it was awkward at first. But then he grabbed my hand, and he cried, and I cried, and none of the 20 years mattered anymore. We got 2 good years together before he passed. 2 years I almost threw away because I was too scared to hope." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Hope's a gamble, Danny. Always has been. But I'd rather lose betting on it than win by never playing at all." Danny sat with that for a long moment, the words settling into him like something taking root. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steadier than it had been all morning. "Okay, let's do it. Let's go meet her." Bear stood in the clubhouse office with a clipboard full of names, checking off chapters one by one. Sacramento was in. Fresno was in. A dozen brothers from the Nevada charter had already texted their arrival times. The reunion was 2 days away, and for the first time in weeks, Bear let himself feel something close to peace. He'd spent his whole life around engines and fists and hard men, but this, planning a surprise for a scared kid and a grandmother who never gave up hope, this felt like the best thing he'd ever built. His phone rang. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized, a local area code, nothing saved in his contacts. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Is this Bernard Coletti?" a woman's voice asked, tired, careful. "Yeah, this is Bear. This is Nurse Patterson over at St. Vincent's. You're listed as an emergency contact for Eleanor Reyes." Bear's stomach dropped straight through the floor. He gripped the edge of the desk. "What happened?" "She came in about an hour ago. Chest pains, irregular heartbeat. We're running tests now, but her heart rate spiked pretty severe. The doctor thinks it's stress-related. She mentioned something about a grandson coming to visit soon. Kept saying she had to be there for it. Kept trying to get up out of the bed." Bear closed his eyes. He could see her already. That woman he'd only spoken to on the phone twice. A woman with a voice like warm bread, refusing to lie still even with wires taped to her chest. "Is she stable?" "For now. But her heart's not strong, Mr. Coletti. We need her to rest. No stress, no excitement. We can't say for certain what the next few days will look like." Bear thanked her in a voice that didn't sound like his own, and hung up. He stood there a long moment, staring at the clipboard in his hand, at all those names, all those brothers ready to ride 300 miles for a boy who deserved every bit of it. He thought about how close they'd come. 2 days. 2 lousy days. He found Tank in the garage and told him to hold everything. Don't call anyone else. Don't cancel yet either, just wait. Then he walked up the stairs to the room above the clubhouse, the room that used to be a storage closet before it became Danny's, and he stood outside the door for a second, trying to find words that didn't exist. Danny looked up when Bear came in. Whatever was on Bear's face, Danny read it instantly, the way people who've had bad news delivered to them before always can. "What?" Danny said. Not a question. A demand. Bear sat down across from him, elbows on his knees, and told him everything the nurse had said. He kept his voice steady, kept it plain, because he knew dressing it up would only make it worse. Danny didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, and then, slowly, like something inside him had given out, he folded forward and sank into the chair behind him, his whole body curling in on itself. "She's gonna die before I even meet her," Danny said, his voice cracking down the middle. 17 years and I don't even get one day." "We don't know that," Bear said, though the words felt thin even as he said them. "That's how it always goes," Danny said. "Every time I get close to something good, it disappears. I should have known. I should have never let myself hope." Bear didn't argue with him. He just stood up and grabbed his keys off the dresser. "Come on," he said. "We're going now." Danny didn't move for a second, like his legs had forgotten how to work. Then he stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and followed Bear down the stairs and out to the truck. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed down on both of them like a weight. Danny sat in the passenger seat with his hand wrapped tight around the door handle, knuckles pale, staring out the window at the streetlights blurring past. He held on like he was bracing for a crash that hadn't happened yet. Like if he let go for even a second, everything he'd only just started to believe in would slip away for good. The hospital lobby smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. Bear pushed through the sliding doors with Danny half a step behind him, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were counting down something neither of them wanted to think about. A woman at the front desk looked up. Bear gave her Eleanor's name, and after a few minutes of waiting, a doctor in green scrubs came out to meet them, a clipboard tucked under his arm and tired lines around his eyes. "Family of Eleanor Reyes?" "Sort of," Bear said. "This here is her grandson." The doctor's eyebrows lifted a little at that, but he didn't ask questions. "She's stable for now. Heart rate's come down and she's resting. But I want to be honest with you both. Her heart isn't strong. This kind of stress, even good stress, excitement, emotion, it puts a real strain on her system. We're keeping her overnight for observation. I can't tell you when she'll be ready for visitors, especially something as big as what I understand you all had planned." "Can we see her?" Danny asked. His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. "Not tonight. She needs quiet. Rest, no surprises." The doctor gave them both a look that was kind but firm. "I know that's hard to hear." Bear nodded and thanked him, and the doctor disappeared back through the double doors, leaving them standing in the waiting room under lights too bright for how late it was. Danny sank into one of the plastic chairs, like his legs had given up on him. He stared at the floor, at the pattern of gray speckles in the tile, like if he looked hard enough he could disappear into it. "This is my fault," he said. Bear sat down next to him. How do you figure that? If I never showed up, if Preacher and you never went looking for her, she'd still be fine, sitting at home, not hooked up to some machine. Danny's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees like that would stop it. Everything I touch falls apart. My mom died. Every foster house I ever got comfortable in, something went wrong and I got moved. Now this, I should have just stayed in that tent behind Marge's. At least nobody there was depending on me not to wreck their life. That's not how any of this works, Bear said, low and even. Isn't it? Danny's eyes were wet, but his voice had an edge to it, sharp with fear. Every time I let myself believe something good was going to last, it got taken. I told myself I wasn't going to do that again. Then you all came along, and I let myself hope anyway. And look, Bear didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, letting the words hang in the air, because he understood better than Danny probably realized just how heavy that kind of thinking could get. The hours passed slow. Nurses came and went. A vending machine hummed in the corner. Danny stayed curled into himself, arms wrapped around his knees, and Bear stayed beside him, not pushing, not filling the silence with empty comfort, just present. Sometime around midnight, Bear finally spoke. I got a son, he said. Name's Mikey. Well, he's probably 32 now. Not much of a Mikey anymore. Danny looked up. Haven't talked to him in almost 15 years, Bear went on, staring at the wall across from them like he was looking at something further away than that. His mother left me when he was 7. Said she wasn't raising a boy around this life, the club, the noise, all of it. She wasn't wrong to worry. I was gone more than I was home. Missed birthdays, missed a school play once because a run went bad, and 3 of us ended up in a holding cell overnight. What happened to him? Grew up angry at me mostly. Can't blame him. By the time I tried to make it right, he was already grown. Already decided who I was to him. Told me once that hope was for people who could afford to lose. Said he couldn't afford it. Not with me. Bear's jaw worked for a second. I think about that a lot. How right he probably was to protect himself like that. Danny didn't say anything, just watched him. But I'll tell you this, Bear said, turning to look at him now. I'd give anything to have one more chance to show him different, and I think that's part of why I can't let go of getting this right for you, 'cause I can't fix what happened with my boy, but maybe I can help you get something I never gave him. Danny's eyes filled again, but it was quieter this time, softer. Neither of them said much after that. The waiting room lights dimmed for the night shift, and somewhere down the hall a monitor beeped, steady and slow. Danny's eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of the whole day finally catching up to him, and little by little he slumped sideways in the chair, his breathing evening out into sleep. Bear stayed right where he was, keeping watch beside him through the night. Morning light came through the hospital window in a thin gray line. Eleanor's eyes opened slow, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of the room came back to her, the beeping monitor, the stiff white blanket, and she remembered. Danny, she said. Her voice was scratchy, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. A nurse checking her IV looked up, startled. Mrs. Reyes, you're awake. How are you feeling? I need to see my grandson, Eleanor said, pushing herself up against the pillows. Her hands trembled with the effort, but her eyes were sharp and clear. Where is he? Is he here? He's not here right now, but he's close by. You need to rest, ma'am. Your heart gave us quite a scare last night. I don't care about my heart, Eleanor said, and there was a fierceness in her voice that made the nurse pause. I have waited 17 years to see that boy. 17 years. I am not going to lie in this bed one more day while he's out there thinking something is wrong with me. Get me the doctor. I want to go home. The doctor came in a few minutes later, the same tired-eyed man from the night before, though he looked a little more rested now. He listened to Eleanor's heart, checked her chart, asked her questions about dizziness and pain, and the whole time Eleanor sat there with her arms crossed like a woman waiting for a bus that was already late. "Mrs. Reyes," the doctor said finally, "your numbers are better this morning, but I'd feel a lot more comfortable keeping you here another day or two. Your body needs time to recover from the strain." "Doctor?" Eleanor's voice softened, but there was steel underneath it. "I understand you're trying to protect me. I do. But I have spent almost 2 decades believing my grandson was gone. Gone across an ocean. Gone to a family that wasn't mine. Gone in every way that mattered. And now he's an hour away, waiting to meet me, and you're telling me I should wait longer." She shook her head. "I am 71 years old. I have maybe a handful of good years left in this body, if I'm lucky. I am not spending one more day of them in a hospital bed when my grandson is out there. I'm not missing this for anything. Do you understand me? Anything." The doctor looked at her for a long moment, then sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "If I release you, it has to be with conditions. Someone stays with you at all times today. No stairs. You take it slow, you sit when you need to sit, and if you feel any chest pain, any dizziness, anything at all, you tell someone immediately and you come straight back here. I mean immediately, Mrs. Reyes." "Fine," Eleanor said, already reaching for the blanket to push it off her legs. Fine. Whatever you need. Just get me the papers." It took another hour of paperwork and instructions, and a wheelchair the nurses insisted on, Eleanor grumbling the whole time that her legs worked just fine. "Thank you." But by mid-morning, she was dressed in her own clothes again, a cardigan draped over her shoulders, her white hair combed and pinned the way she liked it, and she was being wheeled down the hallway toward the front doors, her chin high, her eyes bright with something that looked a whole lot like joy, fighting through exhaustion. Outside, the air was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. A car was waiting, arranged by one of the nurses who'd taken a liking to her stubbornness. As they helped Eleanor into the passenger seat, she reached out and gripped the nurse's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me fight you the whole way." The nurse smiled. "Just take care of yourself, Mrs. Reyes, and give that grandson of yours a hug for all of us." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the first one in what felt like days. Bear got the call 20 minutes later. He was standing in the clubhouse garage, coffee going cold in his hand, when his phone buzzed. He listened, said, "She did what?" and then broke into a grin so wide it surprised even him. He hung up and immediately started dialing again, one number after another, his voice steady and sure as he spoke to chapter after chapter across the state. "It's happening," he said. "Tomorrow. Same plan, 1 day late. Eleanor Reyes is going home, and we are bringing that boy to her ourselves." Danny woke to a sound he felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. A low rumble, far off at first, like thunder rolling across flat land. He lay still on the cot in the spare room above the clubhouse, blinking at the ceiling, trying to figure out if he was dreaming. The sound grew. It didn't fade the way thunder does. It got louder, closer, until the window panes buzzed soft in their frames. He sat up fast. His feet hit the floor before his mind caught up to his body. He pulled on his jeans, grabbed the flannel shirt Tank had given him weeks back, and went for the door, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. The stairs down to the garage felt longer than they'd ever felt before. Danny took them 2 at a time, his hand skimming the rail, and when he pushed through the side door into the morning light, he stopped so hard he nearly stumbled over his own feet, Motorcycles filled the lot. Not just the lot. They filled the street beyond it too, rows and rows of them, chrome catching the early sun and throwing it back in bright flashes, leather vests and jackets everywhere he looked, patches from chapters he didn't even know existed. Men and women stood beside their bikes, talking low, checking mirrors, pulling on gloves. The sound of all those engines idling together was like standing next to a waterfall, a steady roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Danny's mouth fell open. He just stood there in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, trying to take in the size of it. He had seen the club's usual crowd at the Tuesday breakfasts, maybe 20 or 30 bikes on a big morning. This was something else entirely. This was hundreds. "Told you it'd be a lot," Bear's voice said beside him. Danny hadn't even heard him come up. Bear stood there in his leather cut, arms crossed, looking out at the sea of bikes with something like pride written across his weathered face. "How many?" Danny managed to say. 350, give or take." Bear said it like it was nothing, like it was just a number, but Danny could hear the weight underneath it. Chapters came in from 4 states. Some of these guys drove all night. "For me?" Bear turned and looked at him then, really looked, the way he had that very first day at the clubhouse gate when Danny had handed back a wallet full of cash he desperately needed. "For what you did," Bear said. "For who you are. Yeah, for you." Danny didn't know what to say to that. His throat felt tight, and his eyes stung a little, and he had to look away, out at all those bikes, all those people who had come from so far just to ride him to his grandmother's front door. Preacher appeared at his other side, resting a hand on Danny's shoulder, warm and steady. "You ready, son?" Danny nodded, even though his legs felt shaky underneath him. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." Tank rolled a bike up close, the one Danny had spent weeks learning to fix, and gestured for him to climb on behind him. Danny swung a leg over, gripping the seat, his heart still pounding, but for a different reason now. Not fear. Something closer to joy. If joy could feel this big and this scary all at once. Bear climbed onto his own Harley just ahead, glanced back once to make sure Danny was settled, then raised a fist into the air. Down the line, one by one, engines revved louder, a rolling wave of sound moving through the whole gathered pack. Then they moved. The convoy pulled out of the clubhouse lot and onto the highway. Hundreds of motorcycles stretched out in a long, gleaming ribbon under the morning sun. They didn't ride like men trying to scare anybody. They rode close together, steady and proud, engines roaring not as a threat but as something like a hymn, a promise carried on wheels toward a woman who had waited 17 years for this exact morning. Mile after mile fell away. Danny held on, the wind pulling at his hair, watching the world blur past, until Tank slowed the bike and the whole convoy behind them slowed too, turning off the highway and onto a quiet residential street lined with small houses and neat yards. Neighbors were already stepping out onto their porches, drawn by the sound, shading their eyes against the sun to watch the astonishing procession roll slowly by. The house came into view slowly, a small white place with blue shutters and a porch that sagged a little on one side. The kind of house that had been lived in and loved for a long, long time. There was a garden out front, rows of marigolds and tomato plants staked with old broom handles, and a wind chime hanging from the porch roof that caught the breeze and sang soft notes into the morning air. Tank brought the bike to a stop at the curb. Behind them, the convoy rolled to a halt in careful stages, engine after engine dropping to a low idle, then to silence, until the whole street sat in a quiet that felt almost holy after so many miles of thunder. Danny's legs wouldn't move. He sat there on the back of the bike, hand still gripping the sides of the seat, staring at the house like it might disappear if he looked away. His chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough room in it for his heart to beat the way it wanted to. "Danny!" Bear was already off his own bike, walking back toward him, pulling his gloves off, finger by finger. He crouched down a little so he was eye level with Danny, the way he might talk to a spooked animal, careful and slow. "You don't have to be scared," Bear said. "I'm not scared." Danny's voice cracked on the words. "I don't know what I am." "That's all right, too." Bear held out a hand. Danny looked at it for a second, then took it, and let the older man help him swing his leg over and stand. His knees felt soft underneath him, like they might not hold. Bear kept a hand on his shoulder, steady, grounding him. That was when Danny looked up at the porch. She was already there. Eleanor stood at the top of the steps, one hand pressed flat against her chest, the other gripping the porch railing so hard her knuckles had gone pale. She was small, smaller than Danny had pictured her in the quiet moments he'd let himself imagine this. Her white hair was pulled back, and she wore a faded blue cardigan even though the morning was warm, like she'd grabbed it without thinking on her way out the door. Tears were already running down her face. They caught the sunlight and slid over the lines of her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She didn't seem to notice them at all. Her eyes were fixed on Danny, and only Danny, like the 350 motorcycles lining her street, simply weren't there. "Danny," she said. It came out broken, barely a whisper, but it carried across the quiet yard like a shout. Danny's throat closed up completely. 17 years. 17 years she had waited, kept his room ready, never stopped hoping, and here he was standing at the end of her front walk, closer to her than he had been since he was a baby too young to remember her face. Bear gave his shoulder a small squeeze. "Go on, son." Danny took a step, then another. His legs remembered how to work somewhere in the middle of the front walk, and by the time he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he was moving faster, not running exactly, but close to it, and Eleanor was already coming down to meet him, her hands reaching out. He walked into her arms, and everything else fell away. She was smaller than he expected, frail in a way that scared him a little, but her arms wrapped around him with a strength that surprised him, holding on like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go even a little. Danny buried his face against her shoulder and felt his whole body shake with the sobs he'd been holding back for weeks, maybe for years, tears soaking into the wool of her cardigan. "I'm here," he managed to say. "Grandma, I'm here." "I know," she wept into his hair. "I know, baby, I know." Behind them, on the street and the sidewalk, and spilling onto the neighboring lawns, 350 bikers stood in complete silence. Not one engine revved. Not one voice broke the moment. Grown men who had ridden through the night, men covered in leather and ink and old scars, stood with their heads bowed or their eyes shining, watching a grandmother hold her grandson for the first time in 17 years. Eleanor finally pulled back, just enough to hold Danny's face between her two trembling hands, searching every inch of him like she was memorizing something she'd been forced to forget. "I never stopped believing this day would come," she whispered. 1 year later, the marigolds Eleanor had planted the summer before were back again, bright orange against the white fence. And Danny knew this because he was the one who had planted them this time. He'd learned that from her, kneeling in the dirt on Saturday mornings, her showing him how deep to push the seeds down, her hands guiding his, even though his were bigger now, rougher, stained with engine grease that never quite washed all the way out. The house still had the sagging porch step, but Danny had fixed the railing himself, using tools Tank had helped him pick out. The wind chimes still sang in the breeze. Danny's room, the one Eleanor had kept ready for 17 years, finally had his things in it. A stack of trade school textbooks on the desk. A jacket the club had given him, patched up special, hanging on the back of the door. A photo of him and Eleanor from the day of the reunion, framed and sitting on the nightstand, right next to the old worn photo that used to live in Bear's wallet. Danny was in his second semester at the trade school now, learning engines the proper way, the way that came with certificates and real grades, instead of just what Tank had taught him in the garage. He was good at it. Everybody said so. His instructors, the other students, even the gruff old head mechanic who didn't hand out compliments easy. Danny didn't let it go to his head. He just kept his hands busy and his head down and worked like every day was a chance he didn't want to waste. Bear still came around every Tuesday, just like clockwork, riding up the quiet street with that same low rumble that used to make Danny's chest tighten with worry, back before he understood what that sound really meant. Now it made him smile. Bear would sit on the porch with Eleanor and drink her coffee, complaining it was too weak, and she'd swat his arm and tell him to be grateful, and the two of them had grown close in a way that still surprised Danny sometimes. This tough old biker and this gentle old woman, trading stories like old friends. Bear brought news from the clubhouse. Preacher was doing fine. Tank had a new bike he was fixing up. The brothers asked about Danny all the time. "You coming Sunday?" Bear asked, most weeks. "Wouldn't miss it," Danny always said. And he never did. Now it was a bright Saturday morning in early fall, and Marge's diner had its windows fogged up with steam and its parking lot packed with motorcycles lined up in careful rows, chrome catching the morning sun. Rita had strung up a hand-painted banner across the front window that read, "Homecoming Breakfast" in big, crooked letters, red and blue, the kind of sign that took real love to make, even if the paint had dripped a little at the edges. Inside, the diner was loud with laughter and clattering plates, bikers packed into booths next to teenagers who looked a little lost, a little wary, the way Danny remembered feeling not so long ago. Boys and girls aged out of foster care, same as him, invited here through word that had traveled quiet and steady through shelters, and caseworkers who'd heard what these bikers were doing. Preacher sat with two of them now, telling some story that had them laughing despite themselves. Rita moved between tables refilling coffee, beaming like she was hosting her own family reunion, because in a way she was. Out back, in the garage behind the diner where Danny used to sleep in a torn tent, the doors were rolled open wide, morning light spilling across the concrete floor. Danny stood next to an old Harley up on its stand, wiping his hands on a rag, looking over at a skinny kid maybe 16 years old, standing there with his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting toward the door like he was ready to run. "You ever worked on an engine before?" Danny asked. The kid shook his head. "No, never had reason to." "That's all right." Danny set the rag down and picked up a wrench, holding it out. "Neither had I once." The kid hesitated, then took it, careful, like it might bite him. "First thing you gotta learn," Danny said, crouching down by the engine, "is that this bike doesn't care where you came from. It just wants somebody who'll pay attention to it. Same as people, I guess." The kid almost smiled at that. From the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his gray beard catching the morning light, Bear watched them work, watched Danny's steady hands guide the boy's nervous ones, watched patience where there used to be fear, watched hope where there used to be nothing at all. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.